Hey everybody, this is Dr. Young. Class is the Four Horsemen. This is Core 171. This course focuses most intently on the period of the High and Late Middle Ages, but it's difficult to understand, I would say impossible to understand that period without having an appreciation for what we might call the ancient legacy or the legacy of antiquity. People in the Middle Ages took their cues from cultural achievements of the ancient world. The Middle Ages was, and I think I've said this in a previous lecture, a very conservative place culturally. They did not prize the new and innovative. They instead prized the tried and true, the things that were accepted as authoritative and that came from a very, very long time ago. And so one of the reasons for the material in this week of the course, which will, cover some literature from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, as well as some things from the Bible, is to expose us to these cultural foundations of the Middle Ages, to see what was said in the ancient world about war and famine and pestilence and death. Because the things that were said in the ancient world, especially in these authoritative texts about these topics, were the entry point, as it were, for writers in the Middle Ages, that they, when they confronted these things, they thought, okay, what did the authoritative texts say? What did the people of antiquity, the ones we trust, say about this? And then, from there, how should we respond to our current circumstances based on this information we have from the things we accept as authoritative? And so I wanted to talk through some of the basics of this ancient legacy in this lecture, and then look at the assigned texts in turn in the next few lectures. Even though the Middle Ages is, I think we could say, primarily Christian in cultural orientation, that's the most important component of it. Medieval thinkers respected to an incredible extent, right, the accomplishments of pagan antiquity, the accomplishments of the Greeks and Romans. And even though the Greeks and Romans were not Christian, they still had a lot to offer. This information had to be treated very carefully, because obviously, if the text contains information about there being multiple gods, about there being gods named Zeus and Hera and Aphrodite, or Jupiter and Juno and Venus, or depending on whether we're speaking Greek or Latin, obviously Christian thinkers would have said this is wrong. These people were totally misguided, but at the same time, they respected a great deal of what they inherited in terms of the texts that survived into the Middle Ages, what they inherited from the ancient world. And so these are the key components, and this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but the key components of what the Middle Ages took from the Greco-Roman legacy. One of these is the topic of reason, or the whole concept of reason. Thinkers in the Middle Ages prized using reason to work through things that were uncertain. This was not something that, this was not necessarily their first response to things. They would first go to, okay, what does the Bible say about this? Or what did the church fathers say about this topic? Or what can we glean from things that everyone knows is authoritative, everyone knows is inspired? If the question remained open at that point, as it often did, because sometimes, the Bible would have contradictory information. One text in the Bible would say one thing, one seemed to indicate another thing, or one church father would say one thing about a topic and another would say another thing about the topic. Gradually into the High Middle Ages, thinkers started to recognize or admit that just consulting the authoritative text was not enough, and therefore they had to use reason to work through these things. And they often got involved in the creation of logical proofs. If you've ever done a proof in mathematics or geometry or something like that, you will recognize that this is an exercise in logic, right? We start with a given, and then we kind of make a reasonable move to in another direction to a point of soundness, and ultimately we reason through this to reach a conclusion. Well, that's what these thinkers in the Middle Ages did. They got this from reading ancient works, particularly the writings of ancient philosophers like Plato, and eventually Aristotle. Aristotle in particular had a great deal to say about logic, kind of the nuts and bolts of logic. And so medieval thinkers got very excited when they read Aristotle. We could also say that a major legacy of Greco-Roman antiquity is the language of learning. In the Greek-speaking part of the Christian world, of course, the Greek language continued to be used. But in Western Europe and most of the Mediterranean, even in the court circles of the Byzantine Empire, where most people spoke Greek, Latin, which had been the language, of course, of the Romans and of the Roman Empire, was the language of choice, the language of government, the language of learning, the language of even the church liturgy, the rituals and things, the language of the Bible, because they accepted the Latin translation of the Bible made by Jerome, is his name. Jerome's actually pictured here in the red cardinal outfit in this image. But Jerome did a translation of the Bible in the 5th century CE and into Latin, and that over time became the accepted text of the Bible, right? So the language is another thing they got from the Greeks and the Romans. The aesthetics of the world. Medieval people continued to look to the Greeks and the Romans for their models of how to build buildings, how to kind of plot out artwork and these sorts of things. And they did take these things in different directions. There's much less concern about realism, for instance, in the Middle Ages than there had been, when it comes to depicting things like humans and animals and such, right? Medieval figures of art tend to be idealized, and there's not so much concern about the musculature and the proper proportions and those kinds of things. But that aesthetic legacy remains very, very important and is the basis of a lot of things. Like most medieval churches are built in the model of something called a basilica. A basilica has a raised central aisle with shorter side aisles. This was a common Roman architectural form, and that continues to be used. And the term basilica itself changes and comes to connote something about a church over time. The notion of empire is very important to people in the Middle Ages, especially with the creation of empires, or we might even say the reconstituting of the Roman Empire under Charlemagne, and then eventually under the Germanic emperors from the 10th century on. Otto the First, the Ottonian emperor of Germany, is crowned emperor by the Pope, much as Charlemagne had been in the 10th century, and the German kingdom was referred to as the empire. Well, the model for that, of course, is the Roman Empire. And this was seen as the natural order of things. There should be an empire. It should be said that the Pope also claimed kind of the inheritance of the Roman Empire, because, of course, the Pope was the ruler in Rome itself, and by connection to the Eternal City, as it was sometimes called, the Pope, claimed to be the true emperor on earth. And conflict came when the secular emperor and the spiritual emperor, the Pope and the German emperor, got into arguments over who had primacy and those kinds of things, right? But empire is another legacy of antiquity that's bequeathed to the Middle Ages and influences a lot of things. And then the Romans were very, very good at law. And Roman legal texts survived into the Middle Ages. There were some compilations of Roman law done by later Roman emperors, first in the 4th century by the Emperor Theodosius, and then in the 6th century by the Emperor Justinian. And these texts, the Justinian law code known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, started to be taught in schools in Western Europe in the 11th century and became the basis of most European law and eventually the national laws of the European nations. Those have their origins in the Middle Ages. So Roman law was tremendously important. So that's one component of the ancient legacy. The other, well, there are two others. The other one that I think is of prime importance, the third I'll talk about briefly, but it maybe is of lesser importance to the kinds of things that we're doing in this course. But the Judeo-Christian ancient legacy was, of course, of the utmost importance in the Middle Ages. From the text of the Bible and the traditions of the ancient Jewish and Christian religions, the culture of the Middle Ages received its foundation. It was the vast majority of people in medieval Europe were, of course, Christian. There were Jewish communities, some of fairly significant size, a few thousand Jews living in some of the cities of Europe, and then Muslims living in the Mediterranean region, sometimes in fairly large numbers, and even, as the dominant force there in places like Spain and for a time in Sicily and some of the other islands of the Western Mediterranean. But most of Europe was Christian. And the Bible and the Church Fathers were the basis of this. They were accepted as authoritative. The picture at the top right here is of these four figures known as the four Latin doctors of the Church. And these are Ambrose, Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory. Gregory was the only one of the four to become pope. I think that I've got these in the right order. I think this is Ambrose. I think this is Augustine. Actually, this might be Ambrose and this might be Augustine, come to think of it. This might be Gregory. Gregory became pope. And now that I think of it, I actually think this is Gregory because the dove representing the Holy Spirit is often associated with him iconographically. But these were Christian thinkers who lived between the 4th and the early 7th century. Gregory died in 604. And their works on theology, on liturgy, and on ecclesiology, and I'll explain what those three things are, were of tremendous importance. They were accepted as authoritative. And we looked last time, or in one of the previous lectures, at this image of a manuscript page of the Bible, the gloss Bible in the Middle Ages, and you could see, like, here's the biblical text, and then here are the commentaries by people like Augustine or Jerome or Gregory or Ambrose, and there were some others included in this, but these were the four most important church fathers. And so the Bible was the basis of this, but the Bible didn't necessarily answer all the questions. The church fathers wrote extensively on questions of theology, that is, the beliefs, the proper beliefs, right? They wrote extensively on questions of liturgy, that is, what are the right practices in the church, the rituals, the rites that we must perform as part of our worship of Christ. And then the ecclesiology, that is, how should the church itself be governed and structured? What is the hierarchy to this? Gregory is especially important here because he became pope. Of the four of these, he was the only one who became a pope. And the pope, as the head of the Christian church, as the prime bishop, as all of that, really comes as a concept into its own with the reign of Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th century. And so the proper ordering of the church, right, with all of its clergymen in their proper places and the laity looking to the clergy for guidance and all of that, these notions are put into place by the church fathers, inspired by the Bible. They're reading the epistles of Paul and things like that to get some of this, but then they're elaborating on that to a much larger extent, making sure that it's all put into place. And these texts, as I said, were considered authoritative. They sat alongside the Bible as the instructions on how to properly order Christian society. There was, of course, tension between the Greco-Roman legacy and the Judeo-Christian legacy. A late 2nd, early 3rd century Christian theologian named Tertullian asked the question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And by that he means, what do the Greeks and the Romans, representative, kind of in the metaphor of Athens, have to do with Jerusalem, meaning the people of God, the city of God, right? Can the Greeks and the Romans contribute anything to the Christians? And Tertullian was quite skeptical about that, but other Christian thinkers said, yes, we can take things from the Greeks and the Romans, but we need to do it not as a wholesale adoption of these things. There's some imagery from the book of Exodus, which is some of the assigned reading for this week, which talks about the Israelites as they're leaving Egypt, following Moses on the Exodus. They are encouraged by God and even given permission by God to take the wealth of Egypt with them, essentially to steal their gold and their jewels and all of these things, because they're going to need that along their journey, right? And God legitimizes this. And so they use that as a metaphor to say, we can take from the Greeks and the Romans things like their notions of logic, their language, their notions of aesthetics, their ideas about empire and law, and the other things that might be valuable. We have to reject much of their worldview. We, of course, are not going to accept that there are multiple gods. There is only one God, according to the Christians, right? And we're not going to accept their sexual mores or these other things. We're going to reject all of that, but we can take some of these valuable things, like the Israelites spoiled or robbed from the Egyptians. Okay. And the program of education that's set up in the monasteries and eventually the schools and finally the universities of Europe in the Middle Ages adopt this two-pronged approach. Of course, they're teaching Christianity, they're talking about theology, but they're also borrowing a great deal from the Greco-Roman legacy. The last component of medieval culture that comes from antiquity is the Germanic component. Germanic peoples took over parts of the Roman Empire in late antiquity. Starting in the late 4th century, they occupied parts of Rome and eventually sort of took charge. This was not as catastrophic as some historians have made it out to be. There was even, talk of the fall of Rome and all of that, and we may get notions, if you have any knowledge of this period, you may have sort of romantic notions of Germanic, bloodthirsty barbarians sweeping down on civilized Rome and killing and raping and pillaging everything in sight, right? That's not exactly how it happened. For the most part, the Germans were, they were coming into Rome because they were trying to seek stability. They were more economic immigrants than they were invaders. They did eventually take over parts of the Roman army because they were initially recruited into that. Anyway, that's a long story. But the infusion of the Germans into the Roman Empire at the same time as Christianity was becoming the dominant facet of culture in Europe, added a third component to this, right? And from the Germanic cultural legacy came much of what people in the Middle Ages thought about war and about being a warrior. We'll look at some examples of, the survival of this in the Middle Ages. In addition to this, the Germans thought in terms of kingdoms. They respected empire, and many of them certainly wanted to take over the Roman Empire. But they were led by figures that, had various titles, but we can just call them kings. And kings ought to be respected. Kings, had certain responsibilities. They had to lead their people into war, for one. And so a lot of the warrior ethos was tied to the personality of the king himself, and that survives into the Middle Ages and continues to inform things. And there are even, components of law and such from the Germanic cultural world that make it into medieval culture, at least in some parts of Europe, right? So that's kind of the ancient legacy in a nutshell. We will look at more specifics as we go on here. So tune in.